Thank you so much, Nishta, and MRC. Thanks once again for engage in an important topic, which at times does get left behind due to, let's say, the present security environment. And let me start from that aspect that there is a need to relook our security environment, especially in the IOR. Um, Trump 2.0 is creating ripple effects across the world. Europe has had a relook. And although there is nothing directly that impacts the Indo-Pacific or the Quad or the IOR for that matter, but we should be ready for sort of taking on the onus of security in the IOR. And that is, so let me start with the fact that since we are talking about SAGAR and what Professor Rao mentioned, the elements of security and growth, and if we focus on three pillars of enhancing stability, ensuring security, and preserving peace, we wouldn't be too off. And these three pillars are strong, then we can sort of maintain a sort of a strategic security umbrella in the IOR. And I will restrict to the IOR. The Indo-Pacific gets a little too big right now. Right. And it can be argued that whatever multilateralism used to take place or cooperation that takes place between nations is under the security blanket provided by the presence of the US, its alliances, its strategic relationships, and also the strategic relationships between other nations that operate under this sort of a security blanket. So that provides the strength. Now, if the US is going to sort of weaken the threads of that security blanket, then obviously we need to revise the way we look at maritime security, especially, and that is the main meat of today's discussion. So therefore, it is time that middle powers of the Indian Ocean region and all those other nations who have a stake in the IOR get together and work at a semblance of a security blanket. And if you do remember, in the last couple of days, we are engaging African nations. We have the Africa-India key maritime engagement, which is ongoing. We also have iOS SAGAR, which is ongoing. So these are all endeavors under the umbrella of SAGAR, which also includes our neighborhood first policy, our Act East, Look West, Indian Ocean Pacific, Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, to name one or two. Therefore, we need to relook all this when we look at the security challenges. And it's a common fact that instability on land will always create instability on the seas. And this is generally on the maritime area, which is adjacent to the unstable land area. But today we have a unique situation where the Red Sea is unstable because of instability at Gaza. So this is an example where two areas which are separated by distance can have a connect due to instability. And we all know the impact of instability in the Red Sea. And instability in any case encourages non-traditional threats to come out. And there's a whole list of them which we've been looking at. And the instability in the Red Sea is a reminder that the first hit is maritime trade. And therefore your growth, which is part of the G, which is part of SAGAR, gets impacted. And then the costs go up. There is rerouting issues that encourages the opening doors for piracy. And therefore there is a need to work together even closer and much more closer. So the question here is that how do we look at it? And do remember that whenever you have a gap, there will be some nation who will be willing to step in. To give you an example, the cutting down of USAID, especially in Africa, has opened the doors for Chinese, so China, to come in and sort of offer a replacement to the USAID, and therefore that is something that we may not like, especially India. This is an example. I mean, China is omnipresent in the Indian Ocean region in various areas. I'll just cover one or two examples a little later when we look at the underwater domain. But another nation that we need to look at very cautiously is Turkey. So Turkey is established in Somalia in a big way. It's got a base. It's looking after their maritime security. It's training its navy. This is something that actually we could have done. But we have Turkey established in Somalia. So the question here is that the more Turkey stays in Somalia, it has more access to the Indian Ocean region. And more recently, it asked for a missile testing area in the Indian Ocean region, because obviously the maritime area it has in its own proximity is too less. So these are certain examples of instability can be created by either gaps being filled up by other nations or due to a loss of interest of a certain power in that region. And therefore, this has resulted in a relook at the rules-based international order. And I go back to the middle pass coming together, which is something we could do. And I think when we look at the nations who are participating in the Africa-India key maritime engagement, we see Sri Lanka is also a part of it. And so therefore, I would say that we need to work together. India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, these are some names that come off the top of my head in the Indian Ocean region. France, which is a prominent player in the Indian Ocean region. So we need to have a relook at how is the security blanket and how is the security engagements going to continue if there is a weakening of that security blanket. And therefore, while there is a rules-based international order, there's a parallel narrative of a deals-based order. So we need to balance the two very, very carefully. So let me come to how this change in the security environment and the incoming challenges, some have been discussed, and I will look at three of them in the underwater domain. So let's look at what the term gaining prominence is seabed lines of communication, which are essentially submarine cables, oil and gas pipelines, and anything that flows on the seabed. We don't know what future technology will tell us. And so therefore, there have been instances of cables being cut. There is sensitivity where submarine cables are considered, mainly due to sovereignty issues and the sensitivity in territorial seas of nations. But there is a counter to this argument that if it is so easy to cut cables, why have non-state actors not done it before? It's obviously they also thrive on the information or the financial transactions that run through submarine cables. But if you are to impact a country, then you just need to cut one or two cables. And if you remember recently, China came out with a statement that they have equipment that is essentially dual use. One is for seabed mining, which is the second point I'm going to discuss. And the same equipment can be used to cut cables. Perhaps that's an indication for things to come. So therefore, we need to be more alert under the underwater domain, specifically where our own national interest and the regional interest as far as under the umbrella of SAGAR is concerned. Back to a little bit on seabed mining. Now, this is an issue that's going to get more and more prickly, especially with the High Seas Treaty about to come into force on the BBNJ. I think the last list I had just noted was that there are 112 signatories or 21 ratifications. It needs 60. Surprisingly, this is one a treaty that India didn't sign on the first day. We've done it with UNCLOS and the other two bouquet, which is the bouquet conventions. That is the Part 11 and the fish shipping agreement, but we are yet to ratify it. But do remember, we did ratify UNCLOS after 14 years, but there is similarity between the BBNJ High Seas Treaty and our Biodiversity Act of 2002. Similar case was our MZI Act of 1976, which predated UNCLOS, catered for a lot of UNCLOS issues which were under discussion at that point in time. So we're on a little bit of a safe ground here. But the problem comes of the International Seabed Authority, and there are questions being raised as to would the private industry be permitted to take part in deep sea mining, and there's a huge narrative going on. And there is also an ongoing issue that they haven't come out with the what is called the exploitation regulations to facilitate a rule-based mining order, which would give a sort of a balance to all nations, whether developing or developed, to make use of the seabed minerals are there. There is much opposition still existing to it. There are some 32 countries either calling for a precautionary pause or a moratorium or a complete ban owing to the negative environmental footprint of deep sea mining. And there has been a multi-year deadlock at the ISA, which is already listed to a deadline. So we need to re-examine these issues, especially if you're going to look at blue economy, which again is another term that needs to be discussed, and where a definition is difficult, it's best to look at that term as a concept. So therefore, India needs to take the lead, especially through IORA, where you have a blue economy discussion already going on. In fact, next month, I'm going to the island of Reunion, where I'll be speaking on blue economy and how IORA under India's leadership can be pushing it. Hopefully, there will be some solutions and there'll be some discussion on that. But again, this is the underwater domain. So the coming challenges are going to be addressing submarine cables, seabed mining, because if we don't do it, there's some other nation who's going to go in. And do remember, Maldives recently permitted China to do underwater surveillance and survey in its maritime zones. This is totally as per UNCLOS, so there is Maldives is free to do what it chooses to do, but it also gives China the opportunity to be legally present in the sea areas of the IOR and surrounding India, and therefore we need to be a little more cautious. Insofar as seabed mining and submarine cables are concerned, again, there is a high-tech requirement. There are specialist ships, there is equipment required. The cost is tremendous. Who are the countries who have this sort of technology? And maybe Arnab may have can add on to this a little later, one of his team, that if we are looking at underwater domain awareness, who are the nations who have the total technology? Maybe offhand, I could say USA, France, Russia, China. If that be the case, then of course they rule the roost, and therefore we need to engage them. No nation is going to give you technology for free or give you access to total technology. So therefore, we need to look inward. We need to develop these areas, and that is something we need to do. The third, more importantly, is of course underwater domain maritime or awareness, which is a part of the MDA part of it. But then again, sensitivities would come in about, and how many nations would agree to have a UDA, would agree to have sensors put in their maritime zones? Nations loath to inform or don't want other nations to know the movement of the submarines. And today you have UUV. So this is a very prickly path we need to tread. So one is technology. The second is money, developing in-house capacities and capabilities, and whom to engage in case you actually want to have a proper underwater domain awareness. And this is something that needs to be discussed. And if we are looking at a new sort of a rules-based international order, and Ambassador Rakesh Sood, in a discussion some time back, said that we are presently a multipolar world without multilateralism. The fallback, to my mind, is minilateralism. So we have the Colombo Security Conclave that is doing good work. So perhaps we need to form certain more minilaterals with like-minded nations, look at a particular issue, put it behind us, and go on to the next. And therefore, we need to have this sort of a conglomerate, maybe operating under the banner of IORA and BIMSTEC, or call it what, or whichever multilateral organization, but picking out nations and working together. I'm a big fan of minilaterals, so I think trilats is the solution. And we need to look at various nations, and these are the some sort of solutions that I can there. And do remember, bigger nations who can withstand pressures will always operate outside the existing legal regimes, whereas middle powers generally tend to follow the legal regime because it's good for their status and it is a solution that they would like to arrive at. And therefore, we are looking at a particular world. I wouldn't even call it a bipolar world, but I'd rather stick to a multipolar world without multilateralism. And so therefore, if we are going to be sort of questioning the motives of bigger nations, then as middle powers, I think we need to act together. And I'll pause here. I'll take on questions later on. I think if I've generated interest in whatever I've said. Thank you.